So I'll go ahead and welcome everyone and get us started. Thanks for joining today's session. Folks who are filling this room, we're glad you're here. Please know that we'll be watching for your comments, watching for your questions, so we'd love them. Today's session is on ways journalists can earn the trust of a diversity of communities by investing in relationships. The three of us could talk about this all day long, so we're going to work really hard to keep it to an hour or less. I'm Caroline Bauman. I'm Chalkbeat's Community Engagement Manager, and I'm joined by a couple of folks in this space who I have long admired. Terry Parris Jr., the public square editor for Headway, which is an initiative from the New York Times, and previously the engagement director at the city in New York. Carew Grovum is the founder of Kimbap Media. It's a consultancy solving problems at the intersection of journalism, technology, and audience. We really want to answer the questions that are most relevant to you all in this room. So please, again, submit your questions. We want them. We want to know who's listening to us. I want to center today's conversation real quick before we jump in. If you're in this room, you know that historically the news industry has cared about a lot of things, but the investment in care from legacy media and community service and public trust has been lacking, and it shows, right? It shows in how communities talk about news. It shows in readership demographics. It shows in studies about trust in news organizations or lack thereof. I want to shout out Trusting News in this space. They do great work. Read everything they write. And so often news organizations try to solve this problem by investing in things, right? Investing in social media, investing in SEO strategies, but creating teams, often audience and engagement teams, and saying, go forth and build relationships with this community or this neighborhood or this group of people isn't going to be successful without resources and strategy and time. And we know that newsrooms are stretched thin. Most of you in this room feel that, I'm sure. And so the harder task of changing behavior and culture is overtaken by what's immediate, the immediate needs. And so we have this problem where news organizations will invest in tools, but not trust. And so today we're talking about the opposite of that, and how to do that without being a senior leader in a news organization or breaking the bank, right? And so at Chalkbeat, we believe that news organizations, journalists, no matter where you are in the industry or in your career, can take a first step, which is simply just baking listening into everything that you do. And so at Chalkbeat, a specific way we do this is through a culture of reader callouts, which crowdsourcing through surveys, and building partnerships to actually reach new folks with those surveys, as opposed to the same echo chamber. We also use some texting projects as a way to build a two-way conversation over time. We're going to share more information about both those things in the chat. But listening to your audience and the audience that you hope to reach, right, your stretch audiences, that looks really different for each newsroom and for each journalist. But I think where we most go wrong is by thinking those patterns of behavior will just magically happen in the reporting process. We actually have to go out of our way to listen well, especially to communities we haven't historically reached. So Emma and Terry, I'm excited to start this discussion just with a really simple question, which is, how do you both define listening, and why do you think it's important for journalists to listen? Terry, you want to go first?
No, but I will. Hi, everybody. I think with anything, my thinking and approach has evolved over time, and where I'm at now, and where I think I've been for a couple of years now, and this may not be sort of an insane, sort of a bonkers revelation, but we talk so much about listening. We I remember there was a Neiman article a couple years ago. It was the year of listening, and that all makes sense. But I just for me, the actual act of listening means, how do we respond? How are we not just creating an avenue for people to send stuff in, or to ask questions, or to convene a meeting, or a gathering without some sort of intention at the end, whatever that intention might be, like a story or reporting something out or sharing something back. And it might seem sort of like this is part and parcel of listening, but oftentimes, and I've seen it, that it is not. that we sort of check the box of listening without being serious about what our response is, and however that response might take shape. And for me, that's been as simple as, thank you for coming. Here's a couple questions we forgot to ask, as an email to everybody who showed up to the convening, or it's continued asking questions and digging deeper into a call out. So the way I define listening is really in my response. Every project is different. Every investigation is different. Every story is different, and the responses can be very different as well. But that is, I am only as the listening is only as ever good as your response to the folks who participate.
Yeah, I think that's great. To view it as like a continuous cycle as opposed to a box that you check. You did a listening event and you're done and you can move on. When really what we're trying to talk about here is how are you building trust by like continuously listening? And that's a lot harder and sometimes a lot messier, but a lot more worthwhile. So that's great. Emma, what about for you?
Yeah, so to me, listening and learning go hand in hand, right? One of the best ways that we can learn about a community is to let them tell us about themselves. And that listening, is part of a conversation. We can't just listen in a vacuum, right? Then you won't be hearing anything. And you might feel validated in that vacuum of listening, thinking like, oh, no one is here to complain. We're doing it right, which is not the most genuine way to collect feedback about your performances and your products. So, we always talk about journalists asking tough questions and, having probing questions, but it's really about the answers that we get that inform our storytelling and inform our strategies. And so to me, listening is about reflecting, right? And making sure that you are hearing and learning at the same time. And like Terry said, it's not just a checkbox. Like I heard you said something, but no, like I heard you say something very important about how to attract, news audiences and build trust with them. So I think it's all of those pieces together.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there's this temptation to like put out a survey, do a listening event, a listening focused event, and then we get busy and we like don't do the work of following up, or we don't do the much harder work of like changing something based on what we heard. Maybe
like,
doing a story.
Right? Who didn't show up to that listening event and why? Who didn't fill out that survey and why? Did we create a barrier for that person? Did we exclude them in some way on top of our regular exclusion of them in our coverage and storytelling? Like, have we made this worse in some manner?
Yeah. And like how to create spaces to solve for that, right? Like if Chalkbeat hosts a Chalkbeat event, we're going to get folks who often know who we are, right? But if we hold an event in partnership with a community organization that's focused on the issue that we're really trying to tackle, that opens up the room. And so one of the reasons why, Terry, I've partnered with you over time on events is to do that, is so we could open up the room. And I'm curious what other, to Emma's point about how it's one thing to focus on listening through call outs or events. It's another thing to respond to listening and respond to maybe some of the problems you have listening, right? Whether that's not getting people in the room who are different than the folks who usually email you anyway. And so, I'm just curious, Terry, how you think about how you've thought about specific ways to respond to listening, and also maybe solve for, well, we didn't really reach people we thought we would with that.
Yeah, there's a handful of ways that I approach this, and I'll talk a little bit about some general things and then some more specific things. But in general, and I think this is actually part of what we'll talk about next. But all of the events and all of the call outs and all of the work that I do in terms of collection, of crowdsourcing, of tapping into community or trying to build community, is really thinking about who folks are, where they come from, and how they find you. And the best way to do that, I have found, is to ask folks and to track some of those things, whether it might be zip code, whether it might be offering up voluntary demographic information, and then being able to then go in and analyze that and analyze is a big word that might sound like you need a team of folks to do that. But if you can make a pivot table you can understand where people are coming from. You can understand how they found you. And so for me, one thing is having a really good sense of who is participating as much as I can. So for example, if I'm doing a project around Red Hook and neighborhood in here in New York, and I see that a lot of the zip codes are from Manhattan just across the river, I realize that I'm not reaching the folks in the neighborhood, and that folks are coming to Red Hook from Manhattan, which they normally wouldn't do for sort of a listening session or a project, to observe, to watch as opposed to actually participating. So one thing is making sure that I am doing as best as I can to understand the people who are participating, to identify them or any gaps that show up after I know who they are. The second thing, and this is something that Caroline talked about and that we've worked on in my previous gig, is who does a better job of being trusted than journalists? Who is a better partner than just the city where I used to work? And so that has led us and me to all kinds of different partnerships and collaborations, particularly around libraries or other types of services, because those folks, as we probably all know, particularly in nonprofit media, it's not incredibly diverse readership, right? But if you are looking to reach a diverse audience or people who are not part of that readership, you might want to extend the ability to partner or collaborate or even work with those organizations that are trusted in the ways that we as journalists want to be trusted. Again, libraries, YMCAs, things like this that gather people and bring people into a space. And so we've had a lot of success partnering with these institutions to bring folks that we want to hear from that are not our core sort of, nonprofit media audience into the room to hear from them. And then we've done that with a bunch of different projects. I ran a project called the Open Newsroom that extended into sort of general relevant coverage in specific and explicit neighborhoods that we felt that needed some coverage, as well as special education, in which our partnership was with Caroline, and then finally into voting rights around a primary. And all of those projects partnered with, or at the very least co-hosted events with trusted local institutions, which could be a whole sort of conversation around how journalist organizations feel in terms of partnerships and collaborations with non-journalist organizations. But finding a way to do that really helped sort of diversify our reach.
Yeah, Terry, absolutely. To me, it's just an obvious, you have to do it. It's not optional. You have to partner across what has in the past been boundary lines if you're actually serious about reaching new folks. In Chalkbeat's world, that often means if we're doing an event, for example, on English language learners and literacy, partnering with a group in a specific neighborhood that's working on that thing. And that event is much more powerful. So we've got an audience question, which I'm really excited about. More audience questions, please. Like I said, we want this to be helpful to you. Terry, could you talk about some of the engagement events, initiatives you've done at libraries and how you've set those relationships up?
Sure. And this is what I said in the private chat, which was how much time do we actually have to kind of go through how to set up meetings? But here's how it started, is that I found someone who thought the way I did at the library, that we needed to open up the avenues in which we exchange information. And so once I found a friendly audience at the library, we were able to expand from that. And luckily that friendly audience was the head of the Brooklyn Public Library. So I was very privileged in that way. But ultimately, after a couple conversations of how do we think about what we want to do as a journalist organization, as well as knowing that's what a library does do, we essentially said, could we get a room, could we get a basement in 3 different libraries? And the key here was it wasn't also to do one event. We said that over the course of a year, we're going to go back to these these specific library basements or these library rooms. And I think that was really key in getting the library to understand our commitment to this. Because here's also the thing, is that even though we picked 3 libraries, it wasn't as if those 3 libraries and the people in those 3 neighborhoods had wholly different experiences and concerns. We learned a tremendous amount from this small group of folks that we were able to then expand and extend out to general coverage. One of those key things was tenants' rights. And how do we break down the rights of tenants in guarding against eviction, which became incredibly helpful and powerful during the pandemic. And so we didn't sort of, and I've been around this conversation a lot in newsrooms, sort of wring our hands about, we're not going to reach everybody. We're only focusing on certain people and certain neighborhoods. But the idea of being very explicit and deliberate about the neighborhoods that we were in and committing to those neighborhoods let us better understand the issue of folks across New York. And the 3 neighborhoods we went in were Red Hook, East New York, and Bed-Stuy, and all 3 neighborhoods are experiencing various changes, rapid gentrification. Historically, particularly Red Hook and East New York have some of the largest public housing buildings in those neighborhoods, and so we were explicit and deliberate about who we reached out to and how we held these meetings. And then we just worked through the apparatus of the library. We let them do we worked with them on marketing, but they were able to reach out to their people, into these zip codes, and sort of trusting them with the ability to distribute the message, which is also another conversation we could have with newsrooms for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, no, thanks, Terry. That's super helpful. And I'll add, if there are reporters on this call, often the people that you could best partner with, either to help you get a survey in front of folks who would be most helpful in answering it, or do an event, are the folks who are main sources in your stories, right? The experts that you're going to, the community organizations, the teachers group. And so, for reporters maybe in this room, think about that. As you build those relationships through your reporting, it's a natural evolution to then say, and can you help me with this and this and this? And can we work on this together? As Terry said, like, the library was a true partnership. And I think what excites me about all of this is sometimes we can feel really overwhelmed. Like, how do you change a culture in a newsroom? How do you better listen? Those are big questions. A lot of it comes down to systems, whether that's including demographic questions or a zip code question in a survey, or a system of partnerships that are thoughtful and equitable. And Emma, one of the reasons I've loved working with you over the years is because you love systems. And we need more systems in journalism, right? They don't have to be fancy and scary. And so, we're going to talk about internal audits and tracking source diversity here in a second. But before we get into that, over the years in your work as a consultant, you've really been ahead of and in this space of newsrooms trying to build better systems. And I'm curious what some of the most effective measures you've seen newsrooms undertake, in particular with thinking about reaching new audiences and with building trust in mind.
Oh, that's a big question. I think, making it part of everyone's job is really important, right? And making it accessible to anyone within the organization, right? So if we say only marketing can talk to our audience and ask them questions about themselves and their behaviors and their patterns and their lifestyles, how are we supposed to make better decisions as an organization, right? I always just say, if a news organization runs out of money, it's not like they're not just going to close the development office or close the sales floor and the journalists get to keep hanging out. Everyone goes home if your news organization folds, which means that everyone needs to care about the business model or the revenue model and thinking about sustainability, which means that you all need to be thinking about your audience and who those wonderful folks are. So, I think when it comes to building systems, making it mandatory, unfortunately, is the best way to do it. So I think about when I moved my last newsroom to Slack, A lot of people didn't want to use Slack. They really liked Google Chat. They really liked email, which I just wasn't about. And so we made it so that if you wanted your story to be published on our news website, you had to file it through Slack. We had 99% Slack adaptation by the end of the month because everyone who worked for us wanted their stories to go online, right? And they wanted to reach those key audiences. So I think, a little bit of carrot, a little bit of stick, and a little bit of candy always sort of helps to grease the wheels a little bit there, to mix metaphors. So I hope that answers it a little bit.
Yeah. And it brings to mind, I remember pre-pandemic, we did 2 or 3 years in a row of these listening tour style events. And we first introduced them to the newsroom. For sure, the response was like, we're going to do an event to listen and we're not going to do any journalism out of it, or like it's not going to be themed. Like this is too open and scary. And there was a lot of resistance. And so we did make them mandatory for each of our reporting teams. And we learned so much through those. And they were really, really helpful, especially at the start of the school year, to just start from a place of what do audience members most want to know? What are they most concerned about for the school year? But I'm not sure that those would have taken place without some level of, well, we really believe in this and we really got to do it. And I do want to switch to or kind of focus in on, something, Emin, you and I have been working on this year, which is, I think when we talk about representation in journalism, there's so much research and data out there that tells us, like, when communities hear and read voices that remind them of their stories, voices that they trust, that can deepen a relationship with the newsroom, even if they didn't have one previously. But a lot of newsrooms don't have systems in place, right, to help them know if they're doing that well, if they're doing representation in their stories or in their source pool well. But we've seen this change a ton over the last 5-6 years. And so Chalkbeat partnered with RGI to build a free source auditing tool that other newsrooms can use for free. I'm not going to linger on that today, but I will say we'll share a link in the chat for how to take advantage of that tool and how to schedule time with me if you want to sign your newsroom up for it. But as part of that work, Emma, you helped create a guide for newsrooms to first ask, are you even ready to do this work? And if so, like, here's a solid plan. And so you talked to us about what the guide covers. We'll share a link to the guide in the chat as well, and how journalists can use some of those resources to better make decisions around source diversity, but also just generally make better decisions around whatever big issue they're tackling.
Yeah. So the big thing that we want to talk about is is putting everything in context, right? And not setting folks up to fail, which happens a lot with diversity initiatives, right? We'll be like, oh, this is super important. Everyone has to, drink 4 cups of coffee today, but we're not going to make any coffee. There's not going to be any coffee in the office. You just have to find or conjure the coffee on your own, right? That's not setting those coffee drinkers up for success. So among the things we talk about with source tracking is it's not just about saying, do you have enough Black voices in the report? Are there enough women represented in the images? We eventually want to get to a place of sophistication where we're asking complicated questions like, why are all of the Black people in our newspaper athletes or criminals, or accused of being criminals, more importantly, right? Why are all of the Latino voices being quoted about immigration? Right? Where are the school board parents who are Black and Latino? Where are the Black business owners? Where are the Latino politicians talking about things that have nothing to do with their identity, that we afford that privilege to white folks and white sources all the time? So that is a little bit on how you can go from not tracking anything to transforming your source diversity. But knowing that's a big leap for a lot of folks to kind of make in one step, I want to talk about you can't measure what you're not tracking, right? And so the first place to start is to keep track of your sources. There's a lot of big ways to do that, and there's a lot of small ways to do that, right? You could just do it on the back of an envelope with some hash marks and just count at the end of the year and see where you end up. That is a great first step for someone whose news organization isn't bought in yet. And buy-in among staff is the first thing we talk about in our challenges that you may face when it comes to source tracking. you may feel opposition from folks who are saying this is a Band-Aid approach and it's not an actual diversity initiative that improves the conditions for the workers of color in our staff. Fair point. And we'll come back to that, and that this must be part of a larger diversity strategy. Are you worried you'll face opposition from journalists of color who are like, I already know my community. I do not need to count the people that I talk to every single time, right? There will be like good, strong pushback against some of these initiatives coming through. But so we walk through ways to build that buy-in with staff, get the buy-in from leadership, and help to roll it out in a way that is not traumatic to folks, right? We don't want to make people's lives more difficult. We don't want to add busy work to anyone's plate. So a big thing we talk about then is the second challenge, which is time. How do we help journalists make time for this work? Knowing that, okay, now you're going to have to send a survey to all your sources via email. So what can managers do then to create trade-offs for those journalists in order to free up their time? We also talk about creating habits, which is important, right? So a lot of diversity work I use as a metaphor for recycling, right? Like you got to do it all the time. It might not work in the end. We all have to do it. Like Terry can't be a super recycler to make up for the fact that Caroline does not recycle at all. Like it doesn't work like that. We all three of us have to recycle consistently, continuously until the end of time. And allyship and building an inclusive workplace and an inclusive news report works, very similarly. The next challenge we talk about is follow through and kind of how do we build to that next stage of sophistication? How will we know if it's working? How do we know, how do we pivot, right? We find out it's not working. We're collecting data that's not helpful to us. Maybe we're in Minneapolis, we're collecting data by quantifying folks as Black is not helpful because there are Black Americans and there are African immigrants in that community, right? And we want to distinguish that, right? So we want to make sure that our process is iterative, we're able to make pivots and things like that. And then the final challenge that we talk about is putting this all into a big picture strategy around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that source tracking isn't taking the place of other work, that things are working in parallel tracks. And so that, whether your newsroom has a culture problem and how folks treat each other, hiring and retention and staffing problem and how folks are brought into the organization and whether or not they're able to stay. And then finally, the storytelling question, which is really what source tracking gets to, is how are folks from historically marginalized communities represented and talked about in your report. So that's kind of the big overview of that.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful and great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so much there that is so applicable to so many problems. So I really encourage you all to read the guide. And I also, like, if there are individual journalists in this room who say, I'm interested in tracking my source diversity, I don't know where to start, and also my newsroom is like not going to help me do it, let's talk. That's one of our reasons we made our tool, is to help Chalkbeat do source diversity better for the long term without like totally overburdening our journalists who already have many jobs. But we have individual journalists using the tool as well as other newsrooms. And so you don't have to have your whole newsroom a part of the initiative to get started. And I think, Emma, what I heard you say and what has been so true for us with not just source auditing, but so much in this space is like some amount of it is better than none of it at all. And you have to just get started. And whether it's the back of an envelope or a tracker, right? And you have to iterate and like learn from your mistakes. And Terry, that's like engaged journalism 101, right? Like you have to find ways to make time for it, and you have to learn and you have to grow.
Yeah, I mean, everything Emma is talking about is just, it's how we approach so many of these things, just being explicit and understanding and getting started. I mean, I can't sort of underscore that enough. Even my students at CUNY, Emma's students at CUNY as well, is just getting them to do something, to get started. There's a lot of sort of perfection in this field, and there's a lot of sort of like, I'm busy and I need this thing to do this automated thing. But the idea on the back of an envelope with just hash marks, I mean, just to get moving, and whether it is events or call outs or source tracking, just start, and you're gonna you'll learn so much from that, you know, from just starting, frankly. I that's the best piece of advice I could give to anybody.
Yeah, I agree. Just do something, right? And like experiment and have fun with it, which I think journalism is like supposed to be fun, right? And sometimes it's not. And so I do want to focus on events before we hopefully open up for some more audience questions. So folks, if you have questions, put them in the chat now. We'd love them. But you know, with events can be such a powerful listening tool and such a powerful tool for growing your audience too. But I think, again, like one of the traps journalists lay for ourselves sometimes is that we design events that either are really in service of readership that we already are reaching pretty easily, right? Or we design events that elevate voices that already have a lot of power and platform, and just don't attract readers beyond our usual circles. But it doesn't have to be this way. Like we can build better events, right? More thoughtful, more equitable events. And so at Chalkbeat, that's looked like elevating students and teachers and parents to the same stages as superintendents and policymakers. It's also, like I said, building events that are solely listening focused, like some of the listening tour work that we've done. Partnering with folks like Terry on things like the open newsroom at the city. But the headline here is that, you know, events that really focus audience and listening don't have to require a ton of funding or your own your own events team. An example at Chalkbeat is we did these pre-pandemic. We're hoping to bring them back in the near future, but we had this kind of office hours series, which was literally just community tabling. Like it was community organizing 101, right? An event is happening in a neighborhood that we would really like to reach more people there, or a community that we would really like to reach more people there, but we don't have those relationships. This organization or group of organizations is hosting a cool after school event or community fair, and we ask if we can come table. And that's all we do is we listen, we ask good questions, and we meet people. It's really fun. People get candy. It's great. And so like that's extremely low lift. Anyone can do that kind of event. But Terry, I'm curious to hear from you. How can journalists design events with listening in mind? And what are some examples you might give from the work that you've done in this space?
Yeah, I mean, all of these are such deep, long questions and things that I wish we had so much more time to explore. But I think with the same way I think about journalism is like, how are we defining what we're doing? How are we defining journalism? What is journalism? What is a journalist? I think the same way with events. I think the term events feels like, you know, it's a New York Times subscriber event, and you're going to listen to these like fancy folks drinking out of these fancy water bottles. And, you know, and when I started thinking about not them as events, but sort of as like, sort of the call outs that I would do out in the world, like on the website, or the way I approach parties, just even like talking to people. We developed this long sort of program called the Open Newsroom that went into all kinds of different places. But it really did start with like 20 people in a room in Red Hook Library. And the first question we asked was, what do you like about Red Hook? That was the first question we asked. We didn't come in and say, what do you think about gentrification? And what do you think about transit? And what do you think of what the mayor is doing? You know, like it wasn't to get people in a room and do a vox pop, which is a terrible term from old tabloid journalists. But it was to understand where people are and where they're coming from. We had 4 questions that night, which were, you know, what do you like about Red Hook? What don't you like about Red Hook? What does it take to live in Red Hook? And who do you talk to about these things? And those were just the 4 questions that kicked off this entire program. Now, sort of a fast forward. Is flash forward even a term? Fast forward to where I'm at the Times now, and I'm doing a very similar event in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. And the question isn't sort of going in and saying, you know, we're going to, or having a panel about development in architecture and gentrification in Anacostia, which is a neighborhood of DC, which is, you know, rapidly gentrifying as well. But it's to talk about, we're holding sort of an exhibit and asking questions that say, what are you hopeful for in the future? What are you worried about in the future? What do you think would, where do you think Anacostia is? What do you need to build the future you want in Anacostia? And it's all sort of built in collaboration with community organizations as well, and arts organizations and youth organizations, not necessarily WAMU in DC, but it is built from, I'm stewarding some of these questions, but it's built from the bottom. The sort of it's built from the community, and sort of the way that I think about, the way that I build these events or any sort of approach is that it is not immediately my needs. This is something that we're talking about. This is not immediately the journalist organization's needs. It's not immediately the output of a story, even though we're talking about responding. And I mentioned responding, I'm not talking that we are writing a 1,200 word story immediately after. But how do you sort of engage people like human beings at these events? And you can learn so much from these series of questions. And I'll go back to something that I said earlier, but all of the things, all of these events that I've worked on with Open Newsroom and the library and Caroline and, these voting projects here in New York City, and now the things that we're doing at Headway, which are sort of small scale listening events, and very much in partnership or in collaboration with the community. It all starts with that term, that partnership, that collaboration. Who can help us work on this? Who do people trust? And how do we work within and with and for that community? It might all sound sort of like 30,000 foot sort of like engagement speak, but that truly is the approach for a lot of these events. And it's finding sort of those yes folks, those people who are interested in helping you. And then I think the sort of one of the well, hold on, I have one more point here. The thing that we are sort of doing in Anacostia isn't that it is of the, is a Times sort of event, and the city and the stuff that we did with the city isn't of the sort of because of these big news organizations. Goes to like reframing this idea of event, to build the thing, to work in what we're doing in Anacostia. I actually went to the BPL and worked with a teen techie program that it wasn't sort of totally outward facing. It wasn't a public event. It was a group of young folks that I've been wanting to work with, and sort of thinking about some of these same issues that we're talking about in Anacostia, about gentrification, about change, about historical disinvestment, and then immediate investment, like right now. So I sort of worked inside this small little kind of private-ish program to ask these questions to young people and to get responses and to figure out, how do we talk about these things? What are the words that we want to use? And it's not to say that this was a focus group at all, because this is a continuing program. We called it the Future Tellers Project, where young folks in Brooklyn are going to help us think about where the future is in some of these questions, but testing it in a way and working with young folks in a way that helps us think about everything. And there's a through line to a lot of what we're talking about, is that a lot of this can be scalable. We're talking about approaches with partnerships, approaches with tracking sources, approaches with other trusted institutions. What I'm doing in that tiny room with the teen techies, those 14 to 18-year-olds, I'm doing the same thing in a public event in Anacostia. I'm also did the same thing to kick off the Open Newsroom project. It was all sort of the ethos of it all is pretty much scalable in how we approach questions, how we approach community, how we ask questions. Sorry about that. I talked
it's all really good.
Too many minutes in a row.
I'm hoping to circle back to some of that, Terry. One just side note, if you feel down about the world, I always say hang out with young people. We get to do that a lot at Chalkbeat, and it's one of my favorite things that we do. So those were great examples, Terry. I'm going to circle back to a couple of them. a couple of those points in a minute. But before I do, we are just going to jump to some audience questions. So if you've got a burning question for Terry or Emma or me, please send them in. We'd love to be able to take the last few minutes here to answer them. So one question we have is, what can I do to start this conversation? This conversation meaning a conversation about any of the things we've talked about today, but most of all, focusing on listening and growing your audience in a way that prioritizes that. What can I do to start this conversation in my newsroom if I'm not a manager or a decision maker? So I'd love you both to answer this. Emma, maybe we can start with you.
Sorry, my phone just rang. So I think, when I think about this kind of question, I think about go back to recycling, right? Everyone has to do it, even if they're like not good at it, right? So like medium good recycling is just as good as like composting in the big picture because people are trying it. So if you're not a decision maker, just try something, right? Like create a small experiment for yourself. Can I talk to more people from different backgrounds this week, right? I remember when I was in college, they had us fill out this very funny demographics survey first year. And one of the questions was, how often do you see people from different races? And as an Asian American woman growing up in Minneapolis, it was like, every day, sir. I'm surrounded by white people all day, every day, right? And so that was an experience I had inhabited, but it occurred to me that there are people who go through weeks without talking to a person of color or person who is not like from a different sexual orientation or gender expression, right? And so I think create a small experiment, try something, and then brag about it. Talk about it on Twitter. Talk about it in a community listening event. Bring it to your managers and your editors and say, look what I did with my free time, with no resources, without a team. Imagine what we could do, decision makers, managers, if you put resources behind this, right? And all of us have been working in engagement journalism for a long time, and so we know that audience is often the smallest team, shunted onto the side and on a lot of new and experimental ideas. So please fund your audience teams, fund your experimentation teams, and encourage innovation among your staff. That's my advice.
Yeah, that's great advice. And like collaborate with your audience team. Like if you're a reporter, like your audience team would love to meet with, like I can say that being an audience team member, we just want to meet with y'all. We want to brainstorm. So that's great advice, Emma. Terry, what advice would you give for a non-decision maker who wants to do some of this work?
I would underscore all of that. I will give a bit of an answer, and I would tread lightly with this answer, but we tend to be rule followers. Interestingly, we are journalists, but we are in newsrooms. We do love the rules. We love to be told where to go and what to do. And sometimes this requires breaking the rules. Sometimes it requires doing something that isn't necessarily always exactly part of what you're supposed to always be doing. So, for example, I worked at Penn Live Patriot News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, as a lead engagement specialist, whatever that means. And basically it was to monitor comments. And I got so bored of monitoring comments that I started, it isn't when I started, but I was doing crowdsourcing projects. And it wasn't explicitly part of my job. And I remember having a conversation with my boss saying, why are you doing so much crowdsourcing? We want people to comment on the site, not give you these answers on the back end and in private, which were wonderful answers that helped us do a lot of stories. And so, it's just one small thing, but I think that it's important for us to be a little bit sort of trailblazy. That isn't sometimes always what technically your boss would want to do, because I don't always think our bosses are always right. And I also don't always think that our bosses are the most ambitious or the most innovative. I've been very lucky, but I also don't think that's the case. And so the good advice comes from Emma. The bad advice, I think, comes from me, but sort of tread lightly in that world, but sort of maybe break some of the rules from time to time.
Yeah, I think if we want to reach new people with our work, we have to do new things. Like I think that is hopefully an obvious sell to our bosses. And then also like have a way to track what you're doing, right? And so like what Terry is talking about with, like he was able to show, we did these surveys, They led to really cool stories we wouldn't have done otherwise. Those stories led to traffic, maybe conversions. Like, there are ways to measure success here in this world. We've done less of that than we should over time, but that would be my advice. Start something and then track it, so you're able to show hopefully some of the successes from it, right? And then that snowballs into freedom to do more of that kind of work. So another question we got that's great. Sometimes we have trouble getting journalists to act on the listening that our engagement team does, right? So that disconnect there between the journalists, the people creating the journalism, and the audience team trying to create the avenues for listening. What options should we consider when we can't get reporters to take up stories? What can we do with the listening when stories aren't an option, or like responding quickly isn't an option? So Terry or Emma, either one want to weigh in on this question?
I think take a step back, right, and try to solve the problem by knitting forces together. Your journalist should be part of the listening process, right? Your engagement team does not exist to serve your reporters, and your reporters do not exist to serve the engagement team. There is no like take a ticket and be served. You know, it's not the DMV. So if the reporters on the beat don't want to take up this story, can the journalists who staff your engagement team create content? Can they create it for social, right? Maybe it's instead of a like, here's 500 words wrap up about this cool thing that we heard about when we were at a listening session, turns into like a reel on Instagram of like, here's 5 things we learned, right? So I think thinking about like storytelling on alternative platforms and avenues, you know, a story in the newspaper is not the end all be all. That is a great way to express journalism, and like many people obviously still make a living doing so. But think about a broader definition of story, of journalist, and of connecting the dots between listening and reaction. I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's great, Emma. And it reminds me that sometimes we'll listen and we'll do the piece of journalism, and then we don't know, we have not confirmed if that piece of journalism ever makes it back to the folks we listen to. And that's like the point. The point is saying, we saw you, we heard you, we're doing things differently because of you. And that can be a really good email, right? Like, Terry, this is something you've done really well in this space. Yeah, so I'd love you to weigh in on what to do if like a piece of journalism isn't the end product.
Yeah, well, first I want to say one thing about sort of like journalists who don't listen, or you know, I think it's one way I think about every newsroom is that it's in thirds. There's a third of the newsroom who is just ready to go and knows what to do and can kind of run with engagement stuff. There's a third who's curious, who needs a little bit of help, and there's a third who just don't give a shit. And that's, you know, I've had way more success in building projects and getting that 2/3 who are sort of interested in this work than me sort of trying, kicking and screaming and pulling that last third to do this type of stuff. And here's also the thing is that I learned too, is that as those 2/3 become more successful in terms of reaching folks, in terms of building listening projects, in terms of enriching their stories, whether it's investigative work at ProPublica, where I was a deputy editor, or at the city, or wherever, that there's a portion of that third, I don't know where I'm flipped, but that third that doesn't want to do it starts to trickle into those 2/3. And so don't bang your head up against a journalist who just is like not super there and not interested. Find those who are willing to kind of go along with you, whether you are helping them specifically in their game, or you just give them a forum and they're already in it, reading, analyzing, thinking about what's next from this sort of call out.
Yeah, hopefully you can find like a champion in your newsroom, right, who can show what that relationship could be from both sides. But then it also goes back again to like measuring success. Like, are you reporting out to the newsroom that X and X initiative, this event was attended by this many people, and we reached this many new folks and have this many new newsletter subscribers? Like, you can build slowly but surely this sense of, oh, the work the engagement team does is really cool, and I want to be a part of that, and I want to do more projects with them. And so don't give up on them, but to Terry's point, find the champions who can create some of those projects that you can then point to. And don't underestimate a really good thank you email, right? Like every time we do a call out at Chalkbeat, every time we close the survey, everybody who wrote into the survey, whether or not they make it into a piece of journalism or not, traditional piece of journalism or not, right, gets an email back from us, personal email saying, thank you so much. Here are some of the things we did out of the survey. It really mattered. Like, please keep talking to us. That kind of thing doesn't take very long. In fact, we have kind of a template for what that email looks like. But it goes a long way. There's nothing worse to me than like someone taking 20, 30 minutes of their time to fill out something really thoughtfully, and then they never hear from you again.
Caroline, can I add something to that?
Yeah, of course.
One thing, also thinking about sort of sources and beats and audiences and communities of projects is, I think there also tends to be there can be a tendency to think that like a call out or a group of if you're doing something, whether it's an event or a call out, is very specific to that one story, but that's not the case. There's sort of a longitudinal aspect, and this is a lot of what Emma was talking about too. There's a longitudinal aspect to any engagement that we do, sort of any tracking, any collection of folks who are interested in a topic or a story or have some experience to share. And I think there's a tendency to think that that's just one thing, but the way that we're approaching it is that it's the building of a much larger sort of community of people interested in stuff. And so even the work that we did with Caroline at Chalkbeat, we started with thinking about special education. And then we sort of went into that and did stories about folks young folks who had dyslexia. Then we sort of did an event that we talked about problem solving in special education, like 2.5 years later. And the folks that we engaged at the beginning of that project, pre-pandemic, were also those, and that had snowballed and helped us develop the event 2.5 years later, post-pandemic. And so this is not sort of one-off projects or one-off databases or one-off anything. These are sort of longitudinal stories that we should be continuing to reach out to, ask questions to, create a strong feedback loop so they are always involved.
Yeah. And having a system, right? So those spreadsheets don't languish and get forgotten, right? We had a spreadsheet of folks we could go back to thoughtfully and in a way that felt authentic because they hadn't just heard from us one and then we forgot about them, right? So that's a great example.
Can I build on that really quickly? Sorry, I don't have time. But like, talk to your marketing team and your sales team and your membership team, right? If you're gathering information about key people who love your brand and like to interact with it, share that data with the people who are trying to make money for your organization, right? Whether it's grant writers who are going to brag about the amazing connections you've made in the community and the partnerships you've built, or it's going to be the membership team that's going to ramp up their like, hey, do you want to become a member? Special emails to this subgroup of the newsletter list now. Collaborate. Have there be one source of data for as many people as you know about within the organization, no matter where that data comes from. So be generous with your data inside the organization, while still treating your sources, your community members with dignity and respect. Yeah,
that's huge. Yeah, so often teams are siloed, right, to the detriment of the news organization as a whole. So that's great, Emma. Thank you. So I just want to end with one last audience question. We can kind of do this as a lightning round, maybe. But we've got someone in the room who asks, for each of us, what's your top recommendation on starting this work at a new news organization that's small and very niche? I'll expand this to like, what would be our top recommendation for a new newsroom, very small, or like one individual reporter who's maybe starting a new beat or starting something new?
Okay, I'll go. Map out your assets in the community. So the Trusted News Project, Latrell Cranton does this amazing exercise that teaches you to quantify the amazing partners and collaborators and co-conspirators who already exist in your community. So if you start by making a list of those folks, you are in a much better position to start introducing yourself to those folks. And so map them out, make a list, ask for help. But you can't do it alone. And so finding that first partner, finding that launch partner is going to be really important as your first step.
That's great. Terry?
I mean, my biggest piece of advice is not any different than what Emma just said. You can't do that. You cannot do this work without understanding who and what your community is, who's doing any of this stuff. Because one, you don't want to drop in and be like, I'm going to do this thing, and 2 other organizations are actually doing that thing. That's not going to be a good relationship for you. You don't want to come in and sort of dictate the coverage, which I don't think a solopreneur can do. But you can't sort of like you have to sort of understand who is there, who's in the community, and do that work with them. There's nothing else I can say than that. But I would say that another theme that is coming through is tracking your conversations, tracking who you talk to, not just a list, but like, I talked to them on this day, and these are the things they care about. Being able to, so much of this work is about being able to sort of analyze some of what we're already saying, some of what folks are saying, and where folks come from. And so having a good sense, having essentially a really good sort of source list or kind of a community list of folks, and when the last time you tracking that engagement, I think is incredibly important. And I'll add one last thing is I started, one of the ways I got started into this is I worked at Patch, and I was one editor and one reporter, and I couldn't do everything myself. So while I did have an apparatus of sites behind me, and across the country, I was still doing everything in my own. And I wasn't necessarily thinking about voices and diversity, but I was thinking about, how do I get my job done? What is the way I get this done? And the way I got it done was through crowdsourcing, through listening, and through being able to understand who is who wants to collaborate, who wants to partner. And it just came from practical work. And I think, being by yourself helps you kind of think about, like, practically, how do we collaborate? How do I collaborate? How do I partner? So,
Yeah, that's great, Terry. And I think for me, my one piece of advice would be go to more sessions like this, and also find mentors, find people you admire in the industry. I had a conversation with Terry when I was still in college, and I used so much of that conversation to guide me in my first years as building an audience career, building an engagement career. And so don't sleep on that, right? It takes time, but finding your mentors and lovingly copying what they've done as to fit your place and time is a huge resource. So, and the last thing I'll add is just, this work isn't negotiable, I think, right? Like, if we believe in a future of news and believe in future sustainability, like Emma's brought this point home multiple times in this conversation, so has Terry, this isn't just something we do extra that's fun and exciting. If people don't trust us, and if our audience isn't growing, how are we going to handle that as an industry? We have a chance now, I think, to really take advantage of doing something different and exciting. And what Emma does in her consulting work, what Terry is doing at Headway, what we are trying to do at Chalkbeat and VoteBeat, is to keep pushing the space, because we have to keep getting better at this as an industry. So thanks, folks, for joining us today. I hope you learned something valuable. Reach out to us. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I do want to thank Terry and Emma for joining me. These are some of my favorite people in the industry, so I'm glad Google News Initiative put this together so we could hang out and hang out with you all. And thanks, Google News Initiative, for the support of the series. This isn't the only event we're doing. We've got another event called The Big Picture, how to create a strategic plan that dazzles. That's going to have Chalkbeat's Allison Go, Cityside's Lance Noble, and Louisville Public Media Stephen George. It's on October 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. There should be an RSV link in the chat to future events, so we hope to see you there. So thanks again, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Thank you, Emma and Terry, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.